All right, if I hold this here, is that good? All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Farmer School of Business. My name is Michael Conger. I'm the interim chair of the entrepreneurship department and the director of the Center for Social Entrepreneurship here, and also the director of Social Innovation Weekend. I'm the opener for the opener, so I'm going to introduce Professor Kenworthy in a second. He will introduce our speaker, but I just wanted to welcome you. This has been a partnership for several years between our Social Entrepreneurship and Social Innovation Weekend event, which we do every spring, and with the Puff Lecture Series. And so we've been able to figure out how to coordinate topic areas. So if you're at all aware of what you're going to hear tonight, Social Innovation Weekend this year, it's this weekend. The theme is focused on loneliness and isolation. And Social Innovation Weekend is a hackathon-style weekend experience for students. It's open to everybody. So if you are a student here at Miami, graduate student, undergraduate, any major, you're welcome to come join us. We'd love to have you do that. You get a course credit, a credit hour for it, unless you are bumping up against the top limit of the max number of credit hours you can get during the semester. That means no additional tuition for you. So there's free food, there's free coffee, there's all these things. So what will we do? We will explore this topic of loneliness and isolation. You'll work with a team of other people who are from all different kinds of fields and expertise from you. So there will be engineers and artists and business people and social work folks and nutritionists and everybody that you can think of. And we will just work on how can we try to make a difference in this particular space, in this case, loneliness and isolation. So in the past, we've done how do we build resilient communities, food insecurity, housing and homelessness, addiction recovery, infant mortality, climate change. I've missed probably a few, but it's a great time. I hope you'll consider joining us. SocialInnovationWeekend.com is where you would go to sign up, and I hope that we'll see you there. And we're really pleased to be able to have it go outside of the weekend experience and include partnerships with great events like this. So I'm going to invite Dr. Kenworthy. Thanks for giving us the opportunity to share and presenting this with you, and I'll hand it over to you.
Welcome, everybody, including those online. Professor Scott Kenworthy in the Department of Comparative Religion. I want to thank Michael. So the entrepreneurship program helps co-sponsor this event. And all of you who are my students, I really encourage you to look into the Social Innovation Weekend and think about it. It's a very transformative experience. So now I will introduce to you the Puff Lecture Series. During the mid-1890s, two brothers approached, during the mid-1980s, two brothers approached Miami's development office to discuss a suitable tribute to their parents, whose sacrifices had made it possible for their sons to attend Miami during the years of the Depression. These brothers were the Reverend Puff Jr., Reverend Edward Puff Jr., prominent Dayton clergyman, and Professor Harold Puff, who had for many years taught at Miami's Department of Management. The result of these conversations was the Edward A. Puff Sr. and Edith Buckmeyer Puff Memorial Lecture on the Study of Christianity, which has enabled the Department of Comparative Religion to host a long series of eminent scholars as speakers. So a great shout out to those who have supported this lecture series in the past. Unfortunately, we don't have any Puffs with us in the audience, but there may be some online. So we are grateful for that. And now I'd like to introduce to you this year's speaker for the Puff Lecture. Is Professor Myles Werntz, who is a professor at Abilene Christian University. Among other things, there he is the director of Baptist Studies, and he is the author and co-author and editor of many books. I will just name a few. One of which is a field guide to Christian Nonviolence, published in 2020, a co-edited volume on sports and violence, history, theory, and practice, an earlier book on bodies of peace, nonviolence, ecclesiology, and witness of 2014, and earlier than that, a co-edited volume called Corners in the City of God, The Wire, if any of you know that amazing show, and theology. And most recently, a book that is tied to this talk, entitled From Isolation to Community, A Renewed Vision for Christian Life Together. Thank you for coming.
Well, first and foremost, I want to thank Dr. Kenworthy for his very gracious invitation to be with you tonight. It's truly an honor to be giving this lecture. As I was looking back on the list of folks who have delivered this in the past, there's lots of luminaries that I read and have done work with or work on: Charles Matthews, Willis Jenkins, Catherine Breckus. These are leading lights in the field, and I feel honored beyond measure to be included. So my friend Jeremy Everett was with you a few years ago. Jeremy and I went to graduate school together, and one year for grad school Halloween party, I dressed up as Jeremy. That's a story for a different time. But I was really pleased to see that last year's lecturer was William Kavanaugh. He's someone who has been a theological inspiration to me, and so I emailed him yesterday to say it was seemed fitting to be able to go after him. As an academic, it's always nice to think that the things you've written about might be of interest to someone else other than yourself. And I think isolation and loneliness might just be that sweet spot. In the early part of 2020, I began to think about the phenomenon of social isolation and turning to the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer to ask what a Christian account of it might look like. It was the early days of when the COVID pandemic when I began looking at Bonhoeffer, and isolation was really the only way to characterize it, I think. Even when people were gathered together, it was with manifold divisions built into our gatherings, physical barriers, clouds of worry and suspicion. Even when we gathered, there were lingering doubts. My main conclusion from that time was not so much that COVID caused something, so much as that it revealed something, that we live in a profoundly isolated culture. As I began to talk as part of my job with church leaders and denominational figures and ordinary church attenders, I began to suspect this problem of isolation theologically was something about which Dietrich Bonhoeffer might have something to offer. And so, in his work, as I will describe tonight, for Bonhoeffer, isolation is a theological problem as much as it is a cultural and social problem. And because it is a theological problem, it has for Bonhoeffer a theological therapy that can be applied. And the medicine he applies to isolation is good medicine. But while Bonhoeffer may offer something to the problem of isolation, he did not think, for good reason, that responding to the problem of isolation necessarily did anything to solve a fundamentally different phenomenon: loneliness. While isolation was a theological problem he thought to be solved, loneliness is better understood as a pervasive condition with which we have to live. So tonight, I want to introduce us to Bonhoeffer's work a bit, how he proposes to address this question of isolation, as well as how community helps provide and frame an answer to isolation, but also help us to come to terms with the notion that loneliness is not necessarily something that Christianity can solve for good reasons. Rather, his response to isolation, community, is that it is that which helps humans to bear up under the ongoing conditions of loneliness. In his response, I want us to hear something as well. The community, while it is good and true, does not save us from hard gifts like loneliness. Bonhoeffer was the subject of yet another film this past December and was, I think, one of the best Christian thinkers of the last century. He was a German Christian pastor and professor living under the Nazis. He helped organize a resistance called the Confessing Church. It was an alternative to the German National Church, which had given its allegiance over to Hitler. He helped found an underground seminary that lived on spit and baling wire, as the used to say, when the existing seminaries were being encouraged to offer their allegiance to the Fuhrer. He worked with Christians of many stripes to carve out a future for the church and for Germany after the war, and was killed by the Nazis for participating in a conspiracy against the Reich. It's the kind of life which makes for good documentaries and bad feature films, mostly because the most exciting aspects of his biography cause us to miss the more theological and profound aspects of his life. In his writings, we find manifold reflections on what it means to be faithful to his vocation as a pastor and professor, as he reflects on questions large and small, theoretical and practical. But one of the questions that he puzzled out most was what it meant to belong to the Christian church in a world shot through with division and isolation. Living in a world of political and cultural fractiousness as he did, you can see how it came to be concerned with the question, but the problem for isolation was for Bonhoeffer a theological problem as well as a sociological one. So before we get to his solution, let's trace out the problem of isolation as he understood it. As a young theology professor teaching in the University of Berlin, Bonhoeffer delivered a series of lectures on the biblical book of Genesis. And in that, he makes the following observation. Sin has left us in a state of division, broken apart from God and from one another, but also with no clear way of finding our way back to one another. Whereas in the beginning, he writes, we were people with wills which desired only God and the good of one another. We now still long for communion with one another, but without a clear sense of how to restore that unity with one another. Having refused a union which God gave to humanity, we still now try to have the shape of human community, but in a form in which our desire for one another, our will to be in relationship, is now a problem rather than an asset. In the beginning, Bonhoeffer writes, our wills existed in a mediated relationship to one another. We desired one another through God. God, always our intermediary, drawing together beings who were different, unique beings. What we have now, he says, is a simulation of that. As we see with Genesis 2, with the man and the woman accusing one another and yet desiring one another at the same time, Bonhoeffer writes that enmity between persons persists because we have no buffer, a buffer which would mediate together our particular wills. And so we desire to be with one another, and yet our wills create conflict and division at the same time. This direct contact of wills creates a situation in which we're forever then, both desiring to be back together with one another, and yet constantly pushing one another away. This creates a double bind kind of problem. We know that we are broken apart from one another, and yet every attempt to bind ourselves back together exacerbates the problem. For our wills create the scenario in which our union is ultimately becomes the vision of one person writ large. We come back together on one person's terms, replacing our problem of isolation with a different problem of tyranny. Or we wind up with endless conflict of wills in which there is never communion, only détente, only kind of tactical arrangements. At the heart of the problem, he says, is a rejection of mediation. In the beginning of Genesis, he writes, we are given a picture of two people who do not have direct access to one another, but an access to one another made possible by God. And it is then this mediated access which allows humans to have communion with one another. Bonhoeffer's vision of the beginning is one of union and difference, of what humans are meant to be, of humans knit together with God and creation, a vision which is disrupted entirely. In the beginning, he writes, humans do not exist as a mass man, but of differentiation and unity, with weak and strong, united in the act of God. And it is in this way that the differentiations within humanity are brought back together, without the strong able to overcome the weak. The mediation of God provides for both of these parties to exist together into one community. To desire direct access to one means, ironically, that the problem continues. You can see here where Bonhoeffer's account of how isolation works has traction not only theologically, but politically as well. The more we desire to be connected with one another, the more we realize that we need something to facilitate that connection, not just immediacy. This diagnosis of isolation seems so alien to us, for we intuitively think of isolation as a lack of immediacy, as we need more direct contact with one another, not less. That our human relations are best when we have no need for mediation. The more immediately present to one another, the better. How many times might you have said about a loved one that you could tell what they are thinking? This notion that we don't even need the mediation of words or language to understand one another. But, as Bonhoeffer argues, this assumption that we should have immediate access is part of the problem. For when we banish the mediation that allows the difference between people to come to be preserved and replace it with direct contact, our wills come into direct and unvarnished conflict, and the separation from one another just becomes more acute. The more we try to come back together, the more isolation deepens. So this is the problem as Bonhoeffer lays it out. What do we do? How do we find our way out? How do we overcome isolation and find our way back to one another? Let us begin by naming, by Bonhoeffer's lights, what doesn't work. Namely, just getting people together. As much as Robert Putnam is right in lauding the salutary effects of bowling leagues and social clubs, these don't do much from Bonhoeffer's perspective, but actually repeats one of the fundamental ways that humans have, from the beginning, tried to overcome this problem of isolation. Going back to his commentary on Genesis, he says, our response to losing union with others, the sense of being broken apart from one another, is that we adopt one of two postures, both of which you see repeated in the story of Genesis, he says. As the text of Genesis 3 indicates, once sin, a division with God, enters the chat, people attempt to overcome that division in one of two ways. Either by owning it as a right and good feature of what we are as creatures, or by hiding. We try to compensate for the division we have from one another, Bonhoeffer suggests, and the responses of the first two humans are to accuse one another of what has gone wrong, to own isolation as a good thing, or to hide in the trees. In that end, the prototypical responses which we've been finding, that we have to finding out that we can't make it alone, either going it alone as a matter of independence and valor, or seeking out the safety of a crowd. He says either we own isolation in from one another as the way things must be, the opportunity to rise above the crowd in Promethean form, or the opportunity to find solace in a crowd and hide among them to stave off the effects of isolation. He says, but both of these ways, these prototypical ways of resolving our isolation, the individual going it alone, or seeking solace in a sort of in a crowd, a social club, a bowling league, he says, are just two sides of the same coin. They both seek to compensate for a wound that we haven't yet reckoned with. If the original vision of creation was one of communion in which we are mediated to one another by God, then our attempts to overcome this wound, either by owning isolation as a good thing, or taking the Putnam route of just joining a crowd, are ways to try to compensate for them, but without meaningfully challenging the source of division, our will, in any real way. Both of these, by Bonhoeffer's lights, are trying to provide a structural solution to a basic anthropological problem. The central problem for both of these types, the individual and the crowd, remains the will. That when we come into contact with another unmediated, conflict or tyranny occurs. We remain, as we saw in the very beginning, creatures who will, the individual who uses that will absolutely, with others as unnecessary or as obstacles. And in the crowd, seeking to avoid that problem, our wills just exist side by side, relating to others as co-participants in a common effort. It's easy to see why the lone individual is a problem, but crowds, he says, are a much more subtle problem. For in groups, there's a common experience or purpose, but in crowds, the individuals are replaceable. What matters is not the people beside you, not the others who are joined in that common activity. What matters is what matters is not the people beside you, but the common activity out in front. The people beside you could be replaced at any time. The crowd is a step ahead, but it still avoids the basic problem. We are never able to be face to face, but at best only able to exist alongside one another in tactical relationships or temporary alliances. It provides us the chance to exist alongside one another, but not face to face. Bonhoeffer puzzled through this question of how humans are supposed to come back together, most directly in his first dissertation published in Sanctorum Communio, which warrants a bit of attention. In that work, Bonhoeffer examines the problem of human sociality, asking what exactly a community is. And we see in these answers to this question, which he would pose some years later in his Genesis lectures. In human sociality, he said, the will remains the key problem. The will, wanting what it wants, is at the center of different kinds of organizations which humans construct. Some organizations, he said, are constructed in the image of one person, a dominating figure who exercises their will at the expense of others. They might perhaps create an organization in which others fit, but others will be dominated by one figure at the top. People are drawn together, but at the expense of everyone else in the organization losing their will. In other situations, you might have individual people willing together towards something which is out in front of them. These are kinds of organizations which emphasize a common experience, mission, or cause. They too unite people, but simply by pushing the problem of the will out to the side without actually dealing with it directly. In Bonhoeffer's critique of how isolation is perpetuated, you can see images of not just many modern organizational structures, but also why, from his lights, many modern churches still deal with this problem. For both in organizations which are meant to make you more of an individual, that give you the wherewithal to stand on your own 2 feet, and those which emphasize a common experience or a common mission, you still, in either scenario, just have a bunch of fragments existing at best alongside one another, never able to be face to face with one another, without tyranny or open conflict occurring. We remain creatures of will, either alongside one another or against one another, without any reunion at hand. What Bonhoeffer proposes, fitting the problem of isolation, is what he calls community. The community differs from these alternatives of the crowd and the individual in that in a community, one's will is never absolute, but finds its limit in the face of another person. It's a kind of organization where people's wills conflict and connect with one another, and which people find their connection to one another mediated together. When I'm alone, my will for myself becomes an absolute thing. And when I'm in a crowd, I can will alongside one another. But in a community, my will finds a limit to what I can desire, what I can think, what I can need. In the church community, Bonhoeffer writes, the Spirit of God moves through the relationships of the community, binding people together, purifying their wills in humility, joining them together, bringing the virtues of Christ into the deliberations of purpose. In the church community, Bonhoeffer writes, the self becomes porous, open to others, unafraid to have that conflict occur. We do not become a crowd of indistinguishable faces, but a people joined together in a differentiated body, with divided wills mediated together by God. Throughout his better-known life together, Bonhoeffer presumes the community is that kind of social body in which people are mediated together by God, who joins us back together, undoing isolation as a theological problem. But he says, undoing isolation in a community is not magic. It's a matter of practice, of continual habituation. For we begin still as people who want what we want. We do not magically, like Scrooge on Christmas Day, become different people, but unlearn the habits of the will through being in consistent community with others, in which there is give and take, listening and hearing, deliberation and disagreements, undergirded by a commitment to stay together even in times of disagreement. One cannot have a resolution to isolation apart from being united, having been mediated to another person, in and through the banalities and difficulties therein, any more than one can have the fullness of marriage, he writes, apart from the difficulties and joys of one's physically present spouse. So, in some ways, as Screwtape reminded his understudy demon in C.S. Lewis's classic, The Screwtape Letters, the actual physical presence of another person puts to death a lot of the ideas that we might have and the fluffy ideas that we might have about community. In some ways, the vision of community which Bonhoeffer provides is deeply democratic, for it provides a way for all persons to be able to gather together in differentiation, the weak and the strong, of all sorts of differentiations. But in other ways, it's a very heterodox kind of depiction, for it also acknowledges the imperfectibility of our communities. And that for isolation to be undone, it requires not an assertion of our will, but a quieting of the will, a release of the ego, a willingness for us to be mediated together by that which none of us can control. Within Bonhoeffer's theological writings, the community emerges as a theological therapy to overcome the deep human problem of isolation. For in practicing community, we are knit together with God and one another, being mediated together, the weak and the strong, the rich and the poor, the strong personality and the retiring, that they might be held together without being overcome by one another. Our wills can come in contact with one another again. We can will toward one another, he says, as we are mediated together. And through that, we begin to finally be joined back together. This vision of community, as demanding and as precarious as it is, he said, I think is actually pretty good. This notion of addressing isolation through thick communities in which people gather together in humility toward one another, willing one another's good, a community enabled by God, which allows us to draw back together and overcome the fundamental specter of isolation. All that sounds great. Bonhoeffer's concerns here are primarily theological, but they have a lot of promise more broadly in emphasizing the way in which the answer to cultural isolation is not more information, but the giving of one's own sense of identity that you might, in turn, be joined to something larger than yourself. The limiting of our will in the face of it. In doing so, we find one another, and we are joined back together and changed in the process. Sound good? Yeah. It's at this point I want to add a fairly large asterisk. If you can see overhead, like the thought bubble emerging, there's a giant asterisk emerging to the proposal that Bonhoeffer has on offer, or at least an asterisk to our hope that his proposal will somehow offer the promise of happiness or eradicate the primary harbinger of isolation, loneliness. Early on in life together, Bonhoeffer observes that the prisoner, the sick person, the brother in exile, sees in the companionship of a fellow Christian a physical sign of the gracious presence of God. Visitor and visited in loneliness recognize in each other the God who is present in the body. They receive and meet one another as one meets the Lord in reverence, humility, and joy. They receive one another's benedictions as the benediction of God himself. What I want us to notice in this paragraph is that loneliness here is an indicator that the effects and conditions of isolation are always haunting us. They are, for Bonhoeffer, just right there. There's one immediate objection to Bonhoeffer's theological proposal, that no community can really live up to the vision that he cast for it, particularly in a world in which religious participation is always under scrutiny and declining in large parts of Christianity. But there's a different objection that I want to take up tonight, that loneliness, even in the situations where there is strong community, still persists. And here's where I want to offer something counterintuitive. Perhaps loneliness is not something to be overcome. Despite what the former Surgeon General called an epidemic of loneliness in American culture, I want to turn now to ask whether two things might be simultaneously true. That isolation from others might be undone by the gift of community, as Bonhoeffer puts it, and that loneliness might still remain. And further, that it might not be a threat, but a gift which remains to us even in the midst of robust communities. It's worth asking whether a recent trend within Christian thought of re-emphasizing Christian community for all its importance is prone to overpromising on this front. Or more precisely, whether resurgent talk about Christian community over the last 20 years misunderstands exactly what community does. For it's one thing to claim, as I did in my recent book, that these communities are salutary, that the work of belonging to a thick community is the means by which the fractures of human sociality are undone through habit and grace. But it's another thing entirely to say that these communities eradicate loneliness. In the vast literature surrounding loneliness, the definition is pretty contested. At minimum, it refers to the emotional feelings of disconnection from one another. And beyond this, the roots of the experience of loneliness, as they're described in the literature, run deep and wide. For some, it refers to a sense of disconnect between one's accomplishments and one's social connection with others. For others, loneliness connotes the sense of alienation experienced as one matures into adulthood and leaves the intimacy of family behind. As Bonhoeffer's quote indicates, loneliness can emerge from the environmental pressures of being physically divided from one another. There's lots of sources of loneliness here. But the very descriptions of loneliness have this in common: the complex feeling of being out of joint with others, possibly, as with Psalm 88 in the Hebrew Bible, to the point of despair. In the last century, one of the most prominent theological commentators on the question of loneliness was none other than the late Billy Graham, who, like Bonhoeffer, approached loneliness as a theological question during a number of his crusade sermons in the 1980s. Beginning in the 19th century, loneliness was the obsession du jour, subject to inquiry from almost every branch of human knowledge. Interest had waned by the 20th century, which saw a spate of new studies, including David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd, Frieda von Reichmann's seminal essay Loneliness. As cultural historian Faye Alberti argues, the language of loneliness is relatively novel. The phenomenon of feeling separate and unknown has been experienced throughout human history, but descriptions of oneself as separated appear seldom prior to the 19th century. Her own analysis of loneliness shows the way in which the rise of modern forms of work go hand in hand with estrangement from others. When people are told that their existence as a person is wrapped up with their individual agency and their finances, industriousness, and economic value, competitive societies and economies will follow, leaving you on an island. That you succeed, but only at the expense of others, or you succeed, but only because you have divided yourself from others. A society based on a shared assumption that everyone around you is your untrustworthy competitor will surely yield a harvest of division and a bounty of loneliness. While Alberti's account, which links loneliness to capitalism's conditions, explains some of its recent iterations, it doesn't account for loneliness's ubiquity across time, or in cases where economic success is actually present. As one recent study has indicated, the wealthier you are, the less likely you are to feel lonely. But less is different than zero. As the late John T. Cacioppo described it, it's highly probable that loneliness is adaptable to any human situation or any human condition, because it's simply part of what we are prone to as humans. Cacioppo's work as a neuroscientist pushed clinicians and counselors to consider that loneliness maybe is just embedded in the very structures of our brains. Our brains, he said, are socially constituted, such that to think is to look for someone to think alongside. Recent psychological studies have offered corroboration to this account, that as we age, there's a preference for solitude which emerges, but that solitude only works well when there are others around to help nurture that solitude. Some Christian accounts of loneliness in the early 20th century took a tack similar to Putnam's, emphasizing practices of gathering alone as key to combating loneliness. This approach, found in numerous places, is that we are created as communal, interconnected beings and are in need of being together. And perhaps tellingly, these works tend to skirt the key question of loneliness because they think that by taking care of physical isolation, we'll take care of loneliness at the same time. That if one just alleviates separation, loneliness will just take care of itself. But what I want to push forward to the forefront is this. In the literature, whether one characterizes loneliness as created by sociological, economic, or psychological forces, loneliness is, in the best case, kept at bay. It is not solved. Once the conditions of the presence of another person are gone, loneliness returns. And I think Bonhoeffer is actually okay with making that statement. This is kind of a downer point to make, to be sure. Loneliness, however answered in the moment, will return, for loneliness is pretty malleable. It is, as Bonhoeffer knew, part of the condition of being in the world, a world in which we have limited access to even the most intimate of companions. At this point, we don't need to negate what Bonhoeffer put before us, that isolation and the estrangement of people is addressed by community. But the honest news first. Loneliness may not be something to be solved, and Christianity needs to face up to it. As an enduring feature of what we are as creatures, loneliness, as Bonhoeffer knew, is an echo in time of what is true about humans ontologically. We endure loneliness because we are creatures in time who will always be without something which we desire. To borrow an analogy from the church father Augustine, the two things can be true. Isolation can be defeated and loneliness can still reign. For Augustine, if you have been poisoned, just because you've been saved from dying doesn't mean you've been brought back to full health. Even if we are in thick community, loneliness still hangs around. And yet, the overpromising continues. This is, to be sure, not just a tendency seen in Christian discussions around isolation. The Christian life at times has been variously saddled with promising stronger marriages, greater intellectual prowess, or increased happiness. But the assumption that Christianity is the solution to loneliness, I think, seems short-sighted, particularly if loneliness doesn't just have cultural or sociological causes. What I want to suggest here is that Christian discussion of loneliness must broach the possibility that loneliness is just intrinsic to us and not something that religion can promise to remove, and that it might actually have productive elements to it. Saying this is not a sign of defeat to the promise of community, but a way of acknowledging that community, as Bonhoeffer describes it, helps loneliness to have a sustainable home. That it enables loneliness to not be destructive, but rather productive. This is kind of a strange claim to make, but it's a claim that a variety of venerable figures within the Christian tradition, saints, in their unguarded moments, are quite comfortable about making. What these witnesses offer is not so much that Christian community has failed when loneliness appears, but rather that Christian community offers us the kind of accompaniment that can help make sense and bear loneliness without it turning into despair. In her second autobiography, Catholic Dorothy Day famously described her own journey to faith as one that proceeded from partial happiness to the fullness of happiness, from a life devoted to social perfection to one devoted to a society made holy. Day's story, if you don't know the name of Dorothy Day, she really did have a life that someone should make into a biopic, and apparently has been made into a biopic that I didn't know existed until today. Right? Should a director be brave enough to try to tackle it? As a young woman in the 1920s, she left behind her common law marriage and many of her friends, drew together the best of Marxist thought with Catholic social teaching, and co-founded an organization called the Catholic Worker House in New York's Bowery District, along with Peter Morin, founding a community directed toward prayer, works of mercy, elevation of the poor, and as she put it, building a new world in the shell of the old. There's a lot more today. She was an anarchist. She refused to pay her taxes. She was a radical pacifist during the Second World War. She was nobody's friend and everybody's hero. She raised her daughter in what we might call the Catholic Worker House, and now we might call it an intentional community. That is a community built on Benedictine monastic ideals and characterized by common meals, ministry, and times of teaching and discussion. Kind of your idealized life together, your perfect community. Community, she writes, that was the social answer to the long loneliness. In the community of faith, Day learned to pray, to bear burdens, to hear the promises and pardon of God. It gave her the ability to be patient, courageous, to wait, to listen, and to see loneliness as fostering in us a longing for God and the good of community, as difficult as it is. Far from banishing loneliness, she learned in her life with the Catholic Worker House that Christian community made loneliness bearable. It is a long loneliness to live a life with God in the world, Day wrote. When Day writes in her autobiography's postscript that we have all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love, and that love comes with community, we can miss what she's trying to say here. For she doesn't mean that her community life was all roses, but that it was very difficult, and that in those difficulties, it gave her the community to bear up under loneliness and to see it not as an enemy, but an ally. An ally which helped her to distinguish between greater and lesser goods, to endure slow suffering, to expect enough of community, but not demand that it resolve all her problems. Consider, maybe for a second witness here, the parallel witness of Henry Nouwen, French Jesuit priest, better known as one of the founders of the large community, a community of profoundly disabled persons with whom Nowen lived the majority of his life. For Nowen, loneliness was the inalienable companion of life, and perhaps even a prerequisite for a life with God. He distinguishes two types of loneliness, one rooted out of anxiety for companionship, and the other signifying God's presence. In the first loneliness, he says, we are out of touch with God and experience ourselves as anxiously looking for someone or something that can give us a sense of belonging, intimacy, and home. The second loneliness comes from an intimacy with God that is deeper and greater than our feelings and thoughts can capture. It is the second loneliness, he writes, that we must be willing to embrace. Like Day, no one approaches loneliness as an intrinsic feature of the communal life. For in any community, there will be misunderstandings, difficulties, and frequently hard discussions. A life of devotion, as Nowen describes it, will frequently take us where we do not want to go, even if we make that journey in the midst of Christian community. Even within a community, he writes, one might be misunderstood and have to disagree against great odds. Loneliness teaches us, he's thought, to expect modest things from community, and the community in turn helps us not to despair when loneliness appears. For Nowen, though loneliness has a second feature, to orient us towards solitude with God. Loneliness remains an intrinsic condition of living, and taking it too seriously keeps us from often doing the courageous things we should do. For not every courageous action will get us cheers. Some courageous actions will leave us alone. But if we do not embrace loneliness as an opportunity to learn dependence upon God and others, we will constantly be demanding too much for community. We will constantly be asking the community to be perfect, to cheer us on endlessly in courage, when in truth, every community falters. Loneliness here helps us to turn to community, not as antidote, but as a companion of co-laborers and at times co-sufferers. Nowen sees a paradoxical and yet real danger in refusing to let loneliness do its work. That unless loneliness does its deflationary work, we will never be able to appreciate community at all, for we will always be demanding more out of it than any human society can give. Bonhoeffer also draws out this insight in his book, Life Together, where he demonstrates that how we treat community, that when we treat community as the antithesis of loneliness, assuming that because God is knitting people back together, that we will never feel lonely, we place a burden on community that it was never meant to bear, and risk leaving community altogether. Division from one another may very well occur in communities, Bonhoeffer writes, but we must not expect that community will somehow banish the conditions of being a creature in the world. The one unable to be alone, he writes, is the very one who should be wary of community, for they will always expect it to alleviate their loneliness in ways that it is not meant to. If loneliness remains even in community, what are we to say? The Psalms of the Hebrew Bible are rife with pleas for God to deliver us from despair, to restore us to friends and loved ones. And yet, the form in which these prayers are answered is not, it seems, that the condition of loneliness goes away, but that the pain therein is transformed. Loneliness stretches us out in endurance and in patience, and the community reminds us of these things when we cannot remind ourselves of them. Making sense of loneliness, even within thick communities, is an enduring feature of the lives of modern saints. For Day, that loneliness becomes the cost of living faithfully into a complex community of saints and strugglers. For Nowen, loneliness is the sign that we are in fact approaching solitude with God, a state we embrace to be able to better minister to the pain of others. For Bonhoeffer, loneliness comes with the gift of having been pulled out of the safety of a crowd, being risked to be alone in order that we might be knit back into a new community. If the persistent loneliness of the world reminds us that even the good gifts of grace come to us under the question mark that time places upon them, then the loneliness of the saints helps us to see how loneliness is less a threat, less a sign of starvation than a holy kind of hunger. Loneliness is a pedagogue, which helps us to attend to the pain of others, which drives us to listen more attentively to the wounds of others, to know what words are needed, and to stay with them in times of difficulty. To feel lonely even within the community is not a sign of deficiency of community, as Bonhoeffer puts it, but loneliness becomes a strange gift. Loneliness tells us that the community exists not for itself, but for others, not to solve the problem of being a creature, but to help us to bear it together. And then to listen to one another, the pain of one another, to be made attentive, to have our hands open to suffering, and ultimately to have our lives open to God. The community, in other words, is the company of others who cannot solve loneliness, but help one another befriend it, that through that we might be led to God, to patience with one another, and to the sufferings of the world. Thank you.